Good afternoon. I am Matthew Glantz of the Heartland Institute. I'll introduce our first speaker today. It is Cory Bernardi. He was sworn as senator for South Australia in May 2006. He's had more than 24 years involvement in the Liberal Party in Australia. He is one of the leading advocates within the Liberal Party who stood against the Rudd Labour government's carbon pollution reduction scheme. So good friend. Before entering politics, Senator Bernardi was a business owner and an equity investment fund manager. He is the author of 3 books and recently founded the Conservative Leadership Foundation, a not-for-profit educational, research, and training organization dedicated to developing Australia's future leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, Cory Bernardi.
Well, thank you, Matt, and may I say it's a great pleasure to be here at the Heartland Conference. It's inspiring to see so many people committed to common sense on climate change. I'm going to talk today briefly about the political environment in Australia that led to the defeat of a very damaging bill, which you would know as cap and trade, we call emissions trading scheme, and in Australia it was known as the carbon pollution reduction bill. And in doing so, I want to talk about my own commitment to politics, because I actually got into politics to make a difference. I quite literally wanted to change my country. I, if possible, wanted to change the world. And it wasn't driven by any rosy idealism. It was change based on common sense, practical understanding of how the world works and how Western society functions. Intuitively, I knew that government was a behemoth that stifled rather than created prosperity, and I wanted to change that. Essentially, I wanted change that we could believe in. I know that government often proposed what is in its best interest rather than what is in the national interest. And as a low-tax, small government advocate, since my school days, I vowed that my entry into politics was to do something rather than to be someone. And so I took my conservative social and economic philosophy into Parliament 4 years ago, and I decided that I would be a champion for common sense. And nowhere was this more important than in the debate on climate change. So 6 months after my election, I wrote an essay inspired by Professor Ian Plimer, who is another speaker at this conference today, and it was entitled "Cool Heads Needed on Global Warming." Now, it caused quite a stir, and I remember one of the national newspapers had "Lib declares climate war." So I did declare war on climate change and the climate change movement, and I've been at war ever since. Not battling alone, mind you. There are a number of Australians, of course, who get into it, but in politics, there are very few outspoken advocates about the I guess, catastrophic climate change scenario. So going back to 2006 when I wrote my essay, the political environment was one which is markedly different to what it is today. The public were getting, I guess, tired of a very successful Howard-led conservative government after more than a decade in office. The mockumentary maker Al Gore was in full flight. Australia was in the grip of a punishing drought, which all the climate change alarmists linked directly to carbon dioxide. The deep green catastrophists, if you will, were capitalising on genuine environmental concerns to fuel what I would regard as an anti-Western, anti-industrialisation agenda. And the pivotal moment, I guess, was because the Howard government refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, or perhaps because of it, the government was eventually defeated, but not before, under public pressure, promising to implement an emissions trading scheme of its own should they be successfully re-elected. At the time, the Rudd government, who Mr. Rudd is our Prime Minister currently, he promised an emissions trading scheme because climate change was, and I quote, "the great moral issue of our time." He was elected as an economic conservative and a cap-and-trade big government taxer. It doesn't seem to make sense to me, but it did to the electorate at the time. Now, following our defeat, we had a gentleman by the name of Brendan Nelson who became the leader of the opposition. Brendan was a genuine man. He was supported by the Conservative wing of the Liberal Party and became leader. Now, at the time, he believed that the planet should have the benefit of the doubt in regard to climate change. He thought that Australia should act in concert with the rest of the world. This was a position that people like me could agree to because we knew the rest of the world was not going to take any meaningful action. But there are those within politics who covet senior jobs themselves, and what Brendan's position was used against him by those who demanded some action on climate change. Our position always was officially to wait until after the Copenhagen conference, which turned into the Copenhagen conference, but that wasn't good enough. The Prime Minister, Mr Rudd, wanted to deliver a climate change emissions trading scheme before Copenhagen, and he was supported in this by a number of Liberal Party colleagues. Now, one of these colleagues was Malcolm Turnbull, and climate change became the decisive issue in which Malcolm Turnbull launched a challenge for the leadership. So there had been so much undermining of the Liberal Party position that Brendan Nelson, the leader, declared the position vacant, and so there was a ballot. Malcolm Turnbull won in a very narrow contest by two or three votes. And so officially, our position and approach towards climate change started to change in itself. And where we previously had a definitive position, which is wait until after Copenhagen, it slowly morphed into we should be taking action now, we need to support the government on their program as it goes. And I'll take you through the timelines of that just for a moment. So when the emissions trading bill was introduced into the Parliament initially, it was defeated in the Senate, passed through the House of Representatives, as is the want. We voted along party lines. But in the Senate, it was defeated because officially we wanted to wait until after Copenhagen. Now, before it was reintroduced for a second time, there was some discussion, and Malcolm Turnbull, as the leader, said he wanted to negotiate with the government. And I quote, he said, "The government should be sitting down with the opposition and constructively discussing and negotiating the design of the ETS. We've been ready to do that all year." Well, I can tell you that was news to me. It wasn't what our party room wanted. And later, when Malcolm Turnbull stated in regard to the emissions trading scheme that, and I quote, "changes needed to be made to the scheme, but if I were Prime Minister today, I would not be finalising the legislation until after Copenhagen." Hear, hear, I support that, because that was what our party had agreed. Now, you should be aware that, of course, Malcolm Turnbull as the leader and I had a number of policy differences, and eventually I was removed from my front bench portfolio responsibilities. And as a backbencher, you have a great deal more liberty because you're not constrained by the role or the responsibility of having a leadership position within your own party. So you're effectively a free voice. And to me, that gave me an opportunity to campaign and speak very publicly against an emissions trading scheme. And over time, myself and a number of other senators, and in particular, most notably Senator Bernardi from the National Party, we covered talkback radio, we went and did public speaking tours, we went online and shared our opinion, making the case that an emissions trading scheme was simply a massive tax grab by a big government that was intent on getting bigger. We explained to people that the policy would have no environmental benefits, but would see tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of Australian jobs and industry moved offshore. We were derided as mad uncles, as recalcitrants, as rebels, and worse by our own leadership group, but we dug in for the fight of our life. As I said before, you get into politics to do something, not to be someone. And I realised then, during that campaign, there were two aspects that we had to win if we were going to defeat an emissions trading scheme in Australia. Firstly, I had to win the support of my colleagues, and secondly, I had to get the support of the public. And so, amongst my colleagues, I set to work establishing a group of people that were prepared to stand up for the core beliefs, the Liberal Party beliefs of smaller government and lower tax, sticking up for families, supporting free enterprise and private industry. And this included members of the front bench who risked their own portfolio positions in order to champion the cause. And we met, I won't say secretly, but we met in my office at least once a week during sitting times, and we would speak daily outside of that to discuss the strategy about how we can defeat the emissions trading scheme. Together we mounted an argument against the emissions trading scheme, both in the party room and in the public arena. And slowly the numbers in our support group grew. There were, I would call, silent supporters, those that would just ring up and encourage us and say, keep doing what you're doing, it's a really good thing, but they weren't prepared to publicly go out there themselves. Knowing that there was going to be a very big battle ahead, the respective camps, the pro-ETS people and the anti-ETS people, sought external advice. Malcolm Turnbull, our leader, headed to the United Kingdom to meet with the new Prime Minister there, David Cameron, who had been a strong advocate of the light green shade of environmental policy. I, on the other hand, came to the USA. I met with Representative Setzenbrenner, Senator Inhofe, Myron Ebell from the CEI, and a number of other people in Washington. So you understand the different camps from our perspectives of who we met with. I have no doubt as to which one of us got the better advice, quite frankly. During the trip, an enterprising Australian journalist rang around the backbench members of the Liberal Party in Australia to ask them whether they supported an emissions trading scheme or not. I was very clear and very sure that a majority of my colleagues did not support it. That was a position that the leadership refused to concede or entertain. But the survey, the anonymous survey, showed that an overwhelming number of my colleagues, majority of my colleagues, didn't want an emissions trading scheme in Australia. They thought it was bad for Australian industry, it was going to be bad for our competitive environment, and it was going to have no environmental benefit. So when this became front page news, I was asked when I was in the UK to do an interview in which I made a number of comments that the emissions trading scheme needed to go. And that prompted Malcolm Turnbull, not whether it was me directly or whether it was just the sense that there was a move against the emissions trading scheme, it prompted Malcolm Turnbull to say that if we failed to support the government scheme, the Liberal Party would be decimated in any subsequent election. I, of course, had a different view. I think if you stick up for what is right and you have principle in your politics, the public will become committed as you are if you're on the forces of good, if you like. This was when he committed to supporting the Labor government's passage of the ETS ahead of Copenhagen. It contradicted the public position and the party position. And Mr Turnbull even declared on national radio, and I quote again, that he wouldn't lead a party which wasn't as committed to action on climate change as he was. Now, I felt pretty comfortable with that statement. A number of others probably didn't. But the fact is that this wasn't a leadership issue in politics in Australia. This was a policy issue that became a leadership issue because of the intransigence of a leader to lead public opinion or to actually reflect the will of his party room. So in October of 2009, despite the reservations of some of us, the party room gave the leadership an opportunity to negotiate with the government. Now, I saw the opportunity to negotiate as a means of highlighting all the flaws that were in the government's policy. And so we could do so in a spirit of goodwill, but exposing the weaknesses in their policy. But the negotiation period was scheduled for 4 or 5 weeks, and there was to be no finalised agreement with the government without the endorsement of the party room. And I felt confident that the majority of people in the party room would not endorse any changes or support for an emissions trading scheme. So in the meantime, over those 5 weeks, a number of us put together an online petition where we asked people to submit their details saying they didn't want an emissions trading scheme. And at the time, we did it just in an ad hoc manner. But I didn't realise how important the tens of thousands of email addresses and contacts that we got out of this nationally would become. And I'll explain that just briefly in a moment. But 5 weeks had passed. The agreement with the government or the negotiated amendments had been agreed with the government. The bill was reintroduced into the House of Representatives and then reintroduced into the Senate. Now, before debate took place in the Senate, the party room, our Liberal Party room, met to discuss the amendments and to see whether we would be supporting it in the Senate. Now, you have to understand in Liberal Party politics, it's important that the Parliamentary Liberal Party has no written rule book. It operates on a series of conventions, it operates on prudence and goodwill, and one of the conventions is how the party room actually functions. Tradition dictates that policy is taken from the executive level to the party room for discussion. If more than a handful or a dozen people actually speak against a policy, generally that's a sign that there is no consensus and the executive will reconsider the policy in the discussion. That's experience. But when it comes to the ETS debate, after a brief and I would say a misleading presentation in the party room, the discussion began. There were 33 speakers that spoke in favour of an emissions trading scheme and doing a deal with the government, and there were 41 speakers who spoke against. Now, we don't have formal ballots, but 41, a clear majority of people spoke against it. Now, it was clear there was no consensus. There was a vote then taken in the Senate where we had to rush off and have a vote. After 6 hours, we returned and Malcolm Turnbull had declared the meeting closed and said there was an overwhelming majority of people wanting to do a deal with the government. Now, this, I think it was imprudent, and I think that the events that took place after that reflect how imprudent it was. The essence was people were outraged that the will of the party room was overturned, if you like, by a single man, and that it wasn't representative of what we wanted to do as a party. So another meeting was reconvened, and in reconvening another meeting to discuss it, there was a decision by a man named Kevin Andrews to challenge for the leadership. And so Kevin Andrews put his hand up and said, "I'd like to be leader, I want to have a spill." Now, Kevin is a wonderful man, he's a terrific Conservative, but no one expected him to be, a leader of the Liberal Party at any point in time. But Kevin, on principle, said he couldn't stand for what had taken place. And he got 35 votes in the party room with no lobbying or any really orchestrated support. And that woke up to the fact that there was a great degree of unhappiness with the leadership, not just because of the ETS, but an undercurrent of other things. So in that time, the bill was still being debated in the Senate, and it looked like it was going to be lost. Or the debate from my point of view was going to be lost and the bill would be passed. But something happened in the intervening time. I contacted the tens of thousands of people on my email database, as did a number of my colleagues, and we said to them, the fight is not over yet. There is a real opportunity here for us to change and make a difference to the policy. And so those people all contacted their local members of parliament and said, I'm a Liberal Party voter, I'm a Liberal Party member, I support the Liberal Party, but I cannot support you if you go down this path and you pursue this track. And it was the most unprecedented groundswell of grassroots support that has ever been seen in Australia. And there were hundreds and hundreds of emails per hour going into people's offices. There were a number of officers that couldn't cope with the email deluge and the phone calls that they were getting. My name was mentioned by a couple of officers in a very derogatory manner for trying to organise such a campaign. But it was an important campaign because it was the first real mobilisation of grassroots support on the Conservative side of politics, I think, in Australia's history. The party headquarters right around the country were hit with similar sentiments, and frankly, the very viability and future of the Liberal Party was at stake in regard to this. Now, what happened then was a number of us had decided to cross the floor and vote against the bill, and one of the most significant people in our parliament is a guy named Tony Abbott, and Tony Abbott was on the front bench, and he went to Malcolm Turnbull and said, Malcolm, I'm resigning from the front bench because I cannot support this scheme, as did the leader of the opposition in the Senate, Senator Nick Minchin, as did the deputy leader in the Senate. In fact, the whole leadership team in the Senate all resigned en masse because they were unable to support Malcolm Turnbull's and the Labor government's emissions trading scheme. Now, that caused unprecedented pandemonium in the party, and I was one of 8 people that signed a letter calling for a revisit or a reassessment of the leadership, and Tony Abbott put himself forward as a potential leader. Tony Abbott won that vote by one vote. By one vote. And immediately he then put to the party room, who wants to support an emissions trading scheme? And 58 people said no, they don't want to support an emissions trading scheme, and only 29 said they did. So the numbers were pretty right, that we had to, we thought all along the majority of our people didn't want to support an emissions trading scheme. And the turnaround that is made is palpable. We have gone from being in the polls at 40% to now having 50 or 51% in a two-party preferred vote. We've gone from having a desperately unpopular leader to having one that is increasingly popular. We've gone from having a Prime Minister who was 80% approval ratings to now slumping under 50%, all because the Liberal Party decided to oppose an emissions trading scheme. It has quite literally saved the Liberal Party. It's given the public the cause to think and to say, we need politicians of principle, we need parties of principle. We don't want to see a great green tax. We don't want to see government get bigger and broader. And it's given hope, frankly, for Australia's future. Now, the government in itself has dumped its own program for an emissions trading scheme. Remember, Mr. Rudd said it was the greatest moral issue of our time. Clearly, he's got other moral issues to deal with now because he's dumped it and put it off the agenda until 2013 or until the rest of the world acts. What I would say to you all, and I know I'm preaching to the converted, do not act on climate change by enabling a cap-and-trade bill, because if you do that in America, it's likely we're going to have to do it in Australia as well. But the battle is not over. I think the green forces are continuing to marshal their troops, and we will have to continue to rebel it and reject it. So whilst the emissions trading scheme or cap and trade is wounded, it's not yet dead in Australia, but in no small way, the people in this room and at this conference have made an enormous impact in the Australian landscape. And going back to my earlier comments, in some small way, I managed to change my country, and together I think we'll be able to change the world. Thank you.